Hey, it's Luke, and in my second video for this channel, I want to share with you my spiritual awakening story. So when I was going through my kind of spiritual growth and kind of, trying to understand what was happening to me, I think one of the most helpful things that I found was hearing stories from other people going through similar things. So what I'm going to do is talk you through what happened to me. I'm going to talk you through the process of what happened, and I'm going to tie it in with some knowledge that I learned along the way to help you as well. So my original career path was working towards becoming a clinical psychologist. So I was around at 17, I felt quite severely unwell with kind of depression and anxiety and an eating disorder, and that kind of lingered for kind of a long while till kind of my early 20s as well. Kind of went through university and all of that stuff, and kind of during that time I was reading lots of self-help books, lots of psychology books, and I became very fascinated with clinical psychology. So that was my career path, that's what I was heading towards. And I went and got my bachelor's degree, went and got my master's degree, and I came out of my master's degree and I came out to the world, kind of having finished my master's degree. I'd had some psychology roles, some assistant psychologist counselling roles, worked in psychiatric wards, things like that, and I felt incredibly lost, and the depression, the low moods, the anxiety hit very severely. So I became very unwell. I was struggling to move. I was struggling to kind of get out of bed. I was struggling to motivate myself to do anything. I was just really unwell. And kind of those sorts of feelings had been there throughout my journey, but I managed to kind of pull myself out of it a little bit by myself, completely on my own, with cognitive behavioural therapy techniques. So I managed to use kind of CBT techniques that I learned from a book and kind of studying psychology as well to kind of pull myself out of it a little bit, but it was still always there. It was still kind of lingering. But this was probably the lowest I've been ever when I came out of my master's degree. And I was living with my parents, and there was a day where I went out into my garden, my parents' garden, and I went and I sat on a chair that I used to sit on in the sun. It was a warm summer's day, but I was completely engulfed in suffering. I was so unwell, so unhappy, so depressed, so low, so fearful. I was filled with so much anxiety and panic because I felt like I didn't know what my next step was, and I felt like a failure. I felt like I didn't have a job lined up, and all of these really horrific feelings were kind of filling my body, and I was just, it wasn't going away. It was just days I was just feeling like that, and I didn't really know what to do with myself. But then the day came when I went and sat in my garden one day, sun shining on my face, birds singing around me, but I couldn't hear any of that, I couldn't see that, because I was just lost in the suffering. And I was sitting in that chair, and then the most profound, life-changing thing happened to me. As I was sitting in that chair, I started to become aware of, truly this time, what was causing my suffering. And I realised it was the incessant and consistent negative thoughts circling through my mind. But what started to happen during this time was that I started to look at my thoughts. So rather than thinking those thoughts, I began to take a step back from them. I started to detach from them, and I started to just look at them. Started to just watch them. And you know what I mean when I say this, the self-talk, the thoughts in the head. That self-talk that's constant, this voice that's constantly talking. I started to look at it. I started to see it. And then I started to realise, if I'm the one looking at my thoughts, if I'm the one hearing them, if I'm the one observing them, then who am I? because I can't be the thoughts and the one hearing the thoughts. That just didn't make sense to me. And this is when the separation started to happen. I started to, as I refer it to myself because it's more helpful for me, I transcended those thoughts. I took a step back from them. And the moment that happened, the most intense feeling of peace took over me. It was like all of the pain, the psychological pain, the fear, the anxiety, the low moods, the loneliness, the feelings of loss, the feelings of guilt, all of those things that had been circling through my body and through my mind for years just whoosh, washed away in an instant. Just one, it's like one big breath of just whoosh, and it just went. And I was in the exact same position physically. I was in the exact same chair. I was in the exact same garden. I was in the exact same situation. Still didn't have a job lined up. Still living with my parents. All of the things were exactly the same. But I was overcome by this intense feeling of peace and stillness and calm that I'd never experienced before, not in that depth. And then when that happened, that peace took over me and I became just completely alert and present and still and calm, and other people were noticing it as well. People were making comments of just the way I was different. Something had changed about me. They couldn't quite place what it was, but over the next couple of weeks, so for example, over the next 2 weeks, within 2 weeks, I came off of my antidepressants. Before that, I tried coming off of them for so long. I kept trying to come off of them, but I couldn't do it because every time I even reduced the dosage slightly, I started to get really unwell. I started to get really sick feelings. I started to get physical symptoms, and I started to feel really low as well. So I couldn't come off them. I tried for years, and I was addicted. I couldn't come off of them. Within 2 weeks, I stopped them. No more antidepressants. I just stopped taking them. And when the symptoms came up, the physical symptoms of sickness and things like that, or the emotional symptoms of low moods that came up as well when I stopped trying to take them, they weren't affecting me anymore because I was existing not as those symptoms, the physical symptoms and the emotional symptoms. I wasn't those symptoms. I was the one observing them. And when I realised I was the one observing them, I just allowed them to be there, feeling sick, feeling horrible, whatever it was, or feeling low, these low moods that came up. They were there, but they weren't touching me because I'd taken a step back from them. I was just observing them. I was the awareness of them. And this was the process of my spiritual awakening. I started to realise that I am not the body. I'm not the thoughts in my head. I'm not the feelings in my body. I'm the one observing all of these things. And it's when I started to realise that I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my feelings, I'm not my body. I am awareness, consciousness in its purest state. But that was my process of what happened. And then this most intense feeling of love and peace and stillness was just my entire state of being. And sometimes, I'd fall back out of it a little bit. Sometimes I'd fall back into low moods or anxiety a little bit. But when that started to happen, I started to realise those feelings are just feelings. I am the one experiencing them. I am the one observing them. And the moment I could grasp that, they weren't words in my head, but I was becoming aware of that. When that happened, they'd just dissolve, they'd just dissipate. They'd just go. And then the peace remained. So the reason why this reduced all of the suffering that I had been experiencing throughout my life of low moods and anxiety was because I stopped listening to, or I transcended the negative thinking patterns in my mind. So this is why cognitive behavioural therapy works quite well for depression and low moods. It's because cognitive behavioural therapy, one of the leading treatments for psychological problems in the Western world, the reason why it's so effective is because it changes negative thinking patterns to more positive thinking patterns. So for example, people who are depressed will constantly think thoughts and have beliefs like I'm worthless, I'm no good, life is meaningless, I'm a failure. All of those really horrible thoughts. Those thoughts will be causing the depression. Or if you've got an anxiety disorder, one of the biggest causes of the anxiety disorders is the negative thinking patterns, the anxious thoughts, like people are judging me. If you're at a party, for example, people are judging me. I'm going to make a fool of myself. People don't like me. This self-talk, the negative self-talk, that's what's causing these feelings. That's what's causing these negative experiences. It's the negative interpretations that one is making about the world. So the reason why my suffering dissipated in an instant was because I transcended those negative thinking patterns that I had going through my mind throughout the majority of my life. I just stepped out of them. I awakened out of them. And when that happened, those thinking patterns no longer existed, or even if they did come up, they didn't touch me because I was separate from them. I'd taken a step back from them. And because they couldn't touch me, what was happening was that I was just being, observing, and living life without interpreting it. Because that's the cause of suffering. It is not life, for the majority of the time, it is not life. It is the way you are thinking about life. That is what causes suffering. So you'll look at something, maybe it's an event in your life, a situation, a person, or yourself. You look at it, but then you immediately form an opinion, a label, a judgment, and a story, a thought about that thing. Okay, so you're not actually looking at the world. You're looking at the thoughts and interpretations and stories that you're telling yourself, or rather, your ego is telling you about the world. So when I awakened, all of those stories just dissolved. I didn't have to change them from negative to positive like you do with CBT. They just dissolved, and I was just living, observing, and being without having to tell myself stories about the external world. I was just looking at it. I was just observing it. I was just being without the judgments, without the stories, without the opinions. So of course this is what's ultimately meant in the story of Adam and Eve. Some people still don't know this, but the story of course isn't a literal account of how human beings came to be. It's an allegory, it's a metaphor, it's a story that helps people to see this truth. When Adam and Eve ate from the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what happened? They gained the knowledge of good and evil. What does that mean? It means that rather than just living and observing, as most other animals do, if not all other animals do, humans gained the cognitive capacity to label things as good or evil, good or bad. Right? That is the cause of the majority of human suffering, and it's reflected so perfectly in the story of Adam and Eve, because before that, humans couldn't label things as good and evil. Things just were. Things just are. Things just exist. The isness of life, as Eckhart Tolle calls it. Things just are. Things just exist without the need of adding good and evil, good and bad, judgments and stories to everything. You just allow it to be, to exist, to accept life without constantly telling yourself stories about it. When that happens, peace is so... You can't not feel peaceful because you're not resisting life. You are surrendering to life. And to surrender to life means to just acknowledge and accept life as it is without telling yourself a story about it. With the story of Adam and Eve, that's what happened. So Adam ate the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He ate the bit of fruit, and then what happened? He immediately ran away and hid behind a tree because he realised he was naked. He woke up, essentially, but this is a different type of awakening to what's happening now. This was awakening from complete unconsciousness to a slight bit of awareness. So Adam gained a slight bit of awareness, and it's just a story, remember. He gained a slight bit of awareness. He looked at himself and realized, I'm naked. So all of the feelings of shame, guilt, fear, anxiety, all of those feelings came about because he now had possessed the cognitive capacity to label, to think, to judge, to add stories to everything, rather than just being naked. He was now naked, but had labelled that as something that was wrong and bad. He felt shame and he ran away and he hid. That's what the story points to there. So that's what everyone is doing now constantly, is that they're observing the world, they're living, but constantly telling themselves stories about it. So because I took a step back from those stories, I awakened, I transcended those thoughts. Those stories no longer existed to me, or if they did, I didn't have to listen to them if I didn't want to. And then I was just looking at the world as it was, in the present moment, which is only all there ever is anyway. You just look at your surroundings without the stories that you're constantly telling yourself. And hopefully when I say that, you can see why the world would be so much more peaceful. Because most people constantly have this voice that's talking to them, that's either talking about something that could happen in the future, talking about something that happened in the past, talking about yourself, talking about other people. There's these thoughts, right? The self-talk, the voice in the head that's constantly talking, telling you labels, judgments and stories about the world around you, as opposed to just looking at it and to accepting and acknowledging what is. So when you're able to transcend the thoughts of your mind, and that's what this channel is going to be about, it's going to be guiding you to transcending the thoughts of your mind, transcending the feelings of the body, to awakening to consciousness in its purest state, to become just awareness, a present observer, as opposed to being identified with the voice in your head, which is the constant labelling and judgments and stories that get added onto reality. When you can just be, observe, watch, listen, and live without these stories, life takes on an incredible amount of peace. Because the cause of the majority, if not all, of psychological suffering is the thoughts in your head. The stories you tell yourself about your life and about the world. When those stories dissipate and you become a present observer to the moment that you are in, to your present moment, to your now, to just observing the moment you are in, the suffering dissolves. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, please leave a comment. If this resonated with you anyway, please let me know. I love knowing that there are other people out there and I love connecting with you guys. And also please subscribe if you want to learn more about this. And I'm going to be talking through everything really relating to spirituality, and combining it with psychology as well, to allow you to experience the feeling of what I call transcending thought. I use that because it's so much more helpful to me, and hopefully I'll be able to explain that to you in more videos as well. So please leave a comment, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.